This is part 2 in a series on non-dual approaches to meditation. There will be a part 3 at least to make sure that I list specific versions of pointing out instructions. But first, I wanted to talk about counterindications and also set the backstage a little bit so it doesn't seem like this discussion is coming out of nowhere. In fact, this is just a way of being explicit about an aspect of human experience that so many of you experience all of the time, particularly when you just sit after practice. And it can just be interesting, although not essential, to know that some of that really big insight, which is just like awareness itself, is this is an aspect of human experience that I think every religion, every philosophy, every time and place has found ways to language and also found approaches to try to bring about. I mean, even the Western analytical tradition, which many of you are a part of as rational scientists. So Rene Descartes gets a really bad rap because his whole first empirical finding, when he explored the nature of consciousness and God, was, I think, therefore I am. And usually that idea is called the cogito, the sense of identifying with the thinking mind. Exactly what Patanjali in the fourth Yoga Sutra is oh, that's where delusion comes from, right? And so here's Rene Descartes, really the kind of founding father of a lot of Western Enlightenment thinking and scientific method, starting off his whole project in the meditation saying, the first principle of discovery is I think, therefore I am. So yeah, we can read that as identifying with the vrittis of the cognitive mind. But there's also a lot of other spins on that, especially if you really look at his weirdo project. It's like, I'm aware. Awareness is there. At least you can see it as that, and not merely as a recognition of the contents of consciousness, but rather maybe the background possibility of having contents of consciousness. It's also, insofar as we have been conditioned into the Judeo-Christian mindset, I think there's a huge part of that too. In the beginning of Exodus, Moses is like, what is your name, God? And God is like, I am that I am. Something I. And that's like a gesture towards being, right? Sure, there's a lot of metaphysical stuff that's been said about that notion of that which is divine is just beingness, right? But I think there's also the seeds in there in this deeply Judeo-Christian moment, like a founding Judeo-Christian moment of the recognition of the background of beingness as the source of, or awareness as the source of being. For what it's worth, I would submit that none of non-dual meditation and insight is new or foreign to any of us. It's also just, it's something that's in the water and in the air around the shala. It's also something that you can actually try to find. Non-dual awareness is not an attainment, though. This is one of the most important things, is there are broadly, across time and space, 2 routes up the mountain of consciousness. There's, in the sort of yoga tradition, we'd say that's the left-handed path and the right-handed path. There's really across the board. There's the way of work, the approaches to meditation, which are basically everything we think of as meditation, or even a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, where we train the mind. We specifically undertake techniques that absolutely do recondition consciousness. And over time, the neuroplastic nature of mind somehow brings us into increasingly subtle understandings of consciousness itself, as using technique, for example, meditation on the breath, gradually and markedly changes the nature of subjective experience, right? So that's the way of actual attainment, right? And that is real. And I would submit that the really specialized and intensive approaches to training of the mind, going on long retreat and cultivating completely altered states of consciousness over time, that really does do things, and I have done that. And at the same time, there's this whole other left-handed path, this approach to knowledge, direct knowledge of what consciousness is, that has nothing to do with attainment or having rarefied states of awareness. It's just the recognition that awareness is independent of the content of experience, that there's a background awareness to all of, like, that it's often said is the human's birthright, but is sort of independent even of individuals' existence. There's simply a, quote, face you had before your parents were born, that in general isn't summoned by the detailed experiences of everyday life. But when it is pointed out, sometimes the recognition of awareness itself summons kind of the mother of all gestalt shifts. So the background comes to the foreground. It really is the mother of them. And all of a sudden, it's like the old analytical grass, rabbits, right? All of a sudden it's grass, it's forest. And the contents of experience come and go in the background rather than the opposite, right? So those approaches to bringing the awareness itself to the fore and letting the sense of self and sensory experience and the world and all of that just happen against that background. That is what pointing out instructions do. They're just doorways. There are doorways. If there's a left-handed path and a right-handed path, the left-handed path isn't even like a path. It's just like a whole collection of different trapdoors that have different shapes and sizes and go into that meta awareness. The thing I want to talk about now, though, is that even though awareness of awareness doesn't presume or necessarily induce any particular mood, there still are sort of side effects and kinds of energy and kinds of experience that are often, that travel together with the awareness of awareness. And if you wanted to sit and cultivate that background coming to the foreground in a meditative state, which is actually what Kristen and I are doing on Saturdays for a while, and just be in the boundaryless, unqualified state of awareness, well, some of these counterindications can arise. And so, you know me, I'm always careful. I wanted to just start with the three big ones that I can see. The first one is very much a sense of being discombobulated. So awareness itself doesn't presume that you had a face whatsoever. That's kind of the answer to the koan, or the riddle, right? The face you had before your parents were born was no face, but awareness was still there. There was no small self, but there's a real natural, that song by The Weeknd, I can't feel my face when I'm with you. There's some sort of merging, right? A loss of the boundary, a loss of the ways that we have to manifest a personality through like the activity of the neck up. That you really do start to contact that sense. Is sometimes called headlessness, literal discombobulation. But that can lead to all kinds of discombobulated behavior and internal experience. And indeed, an example I would give of this is the community around the followers of what is literally called the Headless Way, who practice deliberately feeling like they don't have heads so that they can experience systematically these insights of awareness just being awareness despite the existence of a small self. The community of practitioners around that tend to be very giddy, tend to be a little slightly off kilter, maybe in a good way, but in a way that we as yoga practitioners can easily identify as vata derangement. So if that's the example, the antidote I would offer is simply that awareness of energy itself that we cultivate through the yoga practice. Like the categories that are offered, the conceptualization of what vata is, or what etheric and windy energy feels like in the absence of more grounded aspects of our energy, right? So if you're working with pointing out instructions and you feel literally vata deranged and discombobulated, some adjustment is actually necessary. There's still, even though this isn't an attainment, and even though there is a directness and truth about it, still the way that we work with it can have an effect on our embodied experience, right? So, number 2, these are all interrelated, is once you have kind of a direct knowledge and ease of access to awareness and the gestalt shift, sometimes it can be incredibly appealing to use that truth as a way to downgrade or devalue the qualities of everyday life and the difficulties of having a mind and a heart. And so spiritual bypassing and spiritual immaterialism are the language we have for the ways that we run away from the meat and the detail of everyday life by pursuing experiences or even just the value of like that which is transcendent of that, right? So much of everything that the Shala is about is not doing that, because we are explicitly a practice for householders, and because there's this whole thing baked in really to the method that tells us that 7th series, the showing up for our obligations in the world and being alive to people who need us in particular, is like the ultimate series, right? Maybe you're learning primary or intermediate or advanced, but like there's a 7th series that is actually the truest yoga, right? So even though we have all these guardrails on that natural tendency to spiritually materialize, fetishize our methodology, or spiritually bypass, it's still useful, I think, especially if some of this stuff becomes extremely beguiling to us, to stay grounded in those teachings about the actual harms and the delusions of bypassing. The classic text on this, which I hope you have all read and have on yourselves and return to, is of course Chogyam Trungpa's Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. It's absolutely brilliant. really good for people in their first couple of years of practice. And then the highly unreconstructed cult leader, Robert Augustus Masters, did an update of that book that I must admit is good, called Spiritual Bypassing. And in particular, for those of you who take seriously non-dual meditation, I recommend a chapter in Masters' book. It's chapter 20, and it's short, called When Non-Dual Techniques Are Not Non-Dual. It's the perfect set of examples for the delusions that we can fall into when systematically practicing non-dual meditation. So that's the antidote to the second counterindication. And the third one, again, pretty related, is I'm just going to tell you the name of it and then give you an example. This is something that Ken Wilber named in his book, Sex Ecology, Spirituality, as the pre-trance fallacy. This is a brilliant insight, really good kind of spiritual technology to have this named. And the idea here is that there are experiences or states of development that are sort of pre-spiritual or pre-cognitive. And then there are even pre-personalized. And then trans-personal and transcendent states of development or consciousness. And it is super, super common in modern sort of poly-spiritual awareness, the one that we've been living in since the 1960s, to mistake experiences of our sort of primal or pre-developed aspects or nature as somehow transcendent, as somehow enlightened. So my very favorite example of this, I just looked it up. It's a TED Talk that now has nearly 29 million views, from this wonderful woman, absolutely wonderful, brilliant neuroscientist named Jill Bolte Taylor. Maybe you remember it from when we were all like being inspired by this when it first came out. It's called My Stroke of Insight. And she had this amazing experience of this sort of oceanic consciousness that happens when you're lobotomized, in her case, by a stroke that took out the sort of ability of the two hemispheres of the brain to talk to each other. And so her entire sense of self dropped away in a way that's like the most dramatic version of what can really happen with effective pointing out instructions. And that is that the identification with the self, you go from being full on in it, and all of a sudden you're like, awareness is something so much bigger than the small self. Awareness is unconditioned and ever present and timeless and spaceless. And so when that happened to this neuroscientist who's deeply entrenched in the analytical and in the sort of dualistic experience of self, it was indeed a sort of transcendent experience, but actually it entailed the loss of everything she knew up until that point. All the very important lessons and insights of just being a human up until that point. All of her brilliance, all of the genuine aspects of being Jill Bolte Taylor that were always online until that moment. And so defining that absolute absence of cognitive or accumulated knowledge as enlightenment is a perfect example of what we all kind of do subtly in this day and age when we think about spirituality anyway. And to reiterate, and watch the TED Talk if this doesn't seem super clear. It's defining those experiences of being deprived of our mundane insights and accumulated knowledge and actual mundane wisdom, the sort of return to the oceanic awareness that makes you cognitively blank as somehow a form of transcendence and enlightenment, rather than what it is, which is precognitive, pre-developed, sort of being part of the primal goo. So it's definitely the case that the trapdoor can open and an individuated human consciousness can go completely disappear into the trapdoor. And the ways of practicing in the non-dual traditions and in the non-dual techniques have to do with not trying to make yourself more cognitively limited, not trying to kill the personality or be somehow outside of the specifics of your empirical reality, but maintaining that work that you've done as a human to come to your understanding of the world up until now, while also holding that in the gestalt shifted awareness of awareness. So the thing is, like, all this stuff is baked into the shallots, baked into the way we've always practiced and approached both the training of the mind and the magic that happens when you just make space for magic to happen, right? And again, if you explicitly start looking for the trapdoor to open, sometimes a more intense version of the non-dual consciousness presents itself. And so I still wanted to now make explicit the ways in which, because it's so awesome, we can very easily try to make a thing of it when it's not a thing. Awareness. That's it. It's not something to attain. It's just something to notice, about which I will say more next time.